Picture this scenario clearly in your mind. It's just after midnight. The Strait of Hormuz, that critically narrow 21-mile-wide corridor of water through which roughly 1/4 of the entire world's seaborne oil supply flows every single day, is pitch black. There are no commercial vessels moving through it. The automatic identification system signals that normally paint the radar screens of every port controller and shipping company on Earth, with dozens of moving vessel contacts, have gone completely silent. The strait that keeps the lights on across Europe, the factories running throughout Asia, and the fuel flowing into every economy that depends on Persian Gulf crude has been transformed in the space of just weeks into something the global maritime world has not witnessed in living memory. A shooting gallery controlled by a guerrilla navy built from the hull up to accomplish exactly one thing: make life absolute hell for the most powerful conventional naval force in human history. And the weapon Iran deliberately chose for that mission is not a submarine. It's not a long-range ballistic missile. It's not a hypersonic glide vehicle or a stealth frigate. It's a speedboat. Hundreds of them, perhaps more than 1,000 of them, depending on which intelligence estimate you trust. Fast, cheap, low to the water, built from carbon fiber composite materials, armed with anti-ship missiles, launched from sea caves and hidden coastal tunnel networks, swarming from multiple directions simultaneously, in a doctrine specifically designed to overwhelm, confuse, and exhaust the layered defenses of a carrier strike group that costs more money to operate for a single day than some nations spend on their entire military budget in a year. Iran just activated its swarm. The strait is on fire. And the question that every naval analyst, every shipping executive, every energy minister, and every admiral sitting in a command center right now is asking is the same one. Can the United States Navy hold it? To understand why that question doesn't have a simple answer, you have to understand what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy actually is, because it's nothing like the naval forces it goes up against, and it was designed that way from the very beginning. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was founded in 1985, in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War, at a moment when Iran had already watched its conventional military get systematically chewed up in years of grinding land combat. The lesson the revolutionary leadership took from that brutal war was not subtle. Conventional symmetrical warfare against a materially superior adversary is a losing proposition. If you cannot match your enemy ship for ship and fighter for fighter, you don't try. You build something fundamentally different. You build a force optimized not for winning pitched naval battles in open water, but for making the cost of operating in your waters so high, so unpredictable, and so exhausting that the enemy decides the price is not worth paying. That's the doctrine the IRGC Navy has refined, developed, and invested in for 40 consecutive years. Not a blue water navy, not a force designed to project power beyond its own coastline, a guerrilla navy, a force built specifically for the confined, shallow, island-studded geography of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, where the advantages that make the United States Navy invincible in open ocean warfare, the carrier's air wing, the Aegis destroyer's long-range missile batteries, the submarine's deep-water mobility, are compressed, complicated, and partially negated by the sheer proximity of everything to everything else. The numbers alone tell you something critically important. Back in 2007, the United States Office of Naval Intelligence estimated that the IRGC operated a fleet of roughly 1,000 speedboats, and that number was growing steadily. By 2020, various intelligence estimates had placed the total fast attack craft inventory somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 vessels when you included the besieged Navy, the paramilitary maritime force affiliated with the IRGC that fields 33,000 boats and 55,000 sailors covering waters from the Persian Gulf all the way down to the East African coast. That's not a typographical error. 33,000 boats. The sheer scale of that number is what makes the swarm doctrine operationally viable in the first place. You cannot sink your way out of a threat that can replace its losses faster than you can generate the sorties required to inflict them. Even after months of American airstrikes and naval engagements in the Strait, with maritime security analysts estimating that perhaps 100 or more IRGC boats have been destroyed since the conflict began, the fleet remains operational and active in the waterway. The losses are real. The capability is not gone. What makes the current situation qualitatively different from every previous episode of Iranian speedboat harassment, the tanker war of the 1980s, the 2008 incidents where IRGC speedboats came within 180 meters of American warships and transmitted radio messages saying, "I am coming at you. You will explode in a couple of minutes." The years of cat-and-mouse encounters that have punctuated U.S.-Iran naval tensions across 4 decades is the technology layered onto the boats themselves and the doctrine that has evolved around them. The IRGC has spent decades methodically studying American naval capabilities and designing its swarm tactics specifically around the gaps and limitations in those capabilities. The doctrine has moved far beyond the simple mass swarming of the 1980s, when Iran would throw dozens of boats at a target from the same direction and accept significant losses in exchange for confusion. The updated doctrine, which Iranian military publications have described as dispersed asymmetric swarming, calls for boats to approach from multiple different directions simultaneously, coordinating their attack vectors to force a defending warship to split its fire control solutions across separate threat axes at the same time. The mathematics of that approach is the core of what makes it genuinely threatening. A destroyer's Aegis combat system can track and engage a large number of targets simultaneously. But every engagement solution it generates in one direction is a computational and weapons resource that is not available for the threat coming from another direction. Multiply that across 20 boats, 30 boats, 50 boats converging from different compass points, and the saturation problem becomes real even for the most sophisticated naval combat management system in the world. And now the boats themselves have gotten dramatically more dangerous. On February 27, 2025, exactly 1 year before the current conflict began, the IRGC Navy unveiled what it described as a game-changing platform during a naval ceremony in Bandar Abbas. The Hajar 110, a 14-meter carbon fiber catamaran combat vessel weighing approximately 9 tons unladen, capable of reaching a claimed top speed of 110 knots. That's 204 kilometers per hour, or roughly 126 miles per hour, which would make it the fastest operational military combat vessel on the planet if the performance figures hold up in realistic sea conditions. For reference, the newest generation of American fast military boats tops out at around 85 knots. The Hajar 110's hull is constructed from advanced composite materials, including carbon fiber, which simultaneously reduces structural mass to enable those speed figures, reduces the vessel's radar cross-section compared to conventional steel or aluminum construction, and allows the rapid acceleration profiles that are essential for the launch and evade tactics at the center of the IRGC's swarm doctrine. The catamaran configuration distributes buoyancy across twin hulls, improving stability at high speed while reducing hydrodynamic drag, which matters enormously when the tactical survival plan depends on being faster than whatever is trying to shoot you. And it's not just fast. The Hajar 110 carries 2 Iranian-made anti-ship cruise missiles derived from the Nasser 1 family with warheads of approximately 130 kilograms and engagement ranges extending from 35 to potentially 50 kilometers or more. That standoff capability is what transforms it from a nuisance into a genuine threat against major surface combatants. A boat that can close to within 40 kilometers, launch 2 anti-ship missiles, and then accelerate away at 110 knots before the defending warship has finished processing the incoming fire solution is not the same tactical problem as a boat armed with a rocket-propelled grenade or a heavy machine gun. The economics of the engagement alone create a strategic imbalance that military planners have been wrestling with for years. The Hajar 110, even by generous cost estimates, is an inexpensive platform. The missiles it carries cost a fraction of what a Western interceptor round costs. When an Aegis destroyer expends a Standard Missile-2 interceptor, which costs roughly $2 million per round, to shoot down a threat from a boat that cost a small percentage of that, Iran is winning the exchange rate calculation even when it loses the boat. But the Hajar 110, as threatening as it is only the most visible piece of a much larger fleet with a much more diverse capability profile. The IRGC operates a layered fast attack inventory built around different boats for different tactical roles. The Ashura class, a veteran of the Sacred Defense era that remains in active service, reaches 90 knots and carries either heavy machine guns or 107mm 12-barrel rocket launchers. The Siraj class, inspired by racing boat design principles, achieves 65 knots and carries lightweight rocket launchers with advanced electronic navigation systems. The Tarek, which was unveiled at the same ceremony as the Hajar 110, is 13 meters long, reaches 90 knots, and has a reported range of 500 nautical miles, longer operational legs than the Hajar for sustained operations further from base. The Shahid Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis class, slightly larger at 300 tons displacement, is built specifically for area denial patrol, with 14 anti-ship missiles aboard and high maneuverability. Together, these platforms constitute what Iranian military doctrine calls a mosquito fleet, individually fragile, collectively lethal, and sustained by a production and dispersal architecture designed to absorb significant attrition without losing functional capability. The hiding places are as important as the boats themselves. Sea caves carved into the rocky Persian Gulf coastline. Underground naval facilities built beneath mountains with entrances below the waterline. Dispersed storage sites on the dozens of Iranian-controlled islands scattered across the Strait region. The geography of the Persian Gulf's northern coastline was practically designed for exactly this kind of distributed maritime guerrilla warfare, and the IRGC has spent 4 decades exploiting every feature of it. On May 7, 2026, this is no longer theoretical. 3 United States Navy guided missile destroyers, the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, were transiting the Strait of Hormuz when Iranian forces launched what U.S. Central Command described as a coordinated, unprovoked attack involving multiple missiles, drones, and fast attack boats simultaneously. The triple-layered nature of that attack is the signature of IRGC doctrine in practice. Missiles to force the Aegis systems into high-intensity engagement mode, consuming interceptors. Drones to saturate the close-in defense envelope and force the ship's crews into maximum alert posture. Fast boats converging from multiple directions to create the saturation problem that swarm doctrine is designed to exploit. U.S. Central Command confirmed that no American assets were struck. The destroyer's defensive systems, backed by Apache attack helicopters and carrier-based air support, successfully intercepted or deterred every incoming threat. American forces then responded by striking the Iranian military facilities responsible for generating the attack. Missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and intelligence and surveillance nodes. But the significance of what happened in those hours is not captured by the clean result of no American ships damaged. The significance is what the engagement revealed about the operational environment that American warships are navigating every time they transit the world's most strategically critical waterway. Go back 3 days earlier. On May 4th, 2026, U.S. Army AH-64 Apache attack helicopters and U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopters destroyed 6 Iranian fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz after those boats threatened commercial and American naval vessels. The choice of helicopters as the primary counter-swarm weapon against the IRGC boats tells you something important about how American doctrine has adapted to the threat. The Seahawk, operating from destroyers, cruisers, and amphibious assault ships, can extend a warship's defensive perimeter beyond the radar horizon, identify and track fast-moving small boats before they reach launch distance for their missiles, and prosecute engagements against those boats without pulling the major surface combatants into the close-range encounter that the swarm doctrine is designed to force. The Apache, Army aviation operating from amphibious assets or shore bases in the theater, brings a different but complementary lethality. 30mm chain gun fire, Hellfire missiles, and the kind of low-altitude maneuverability that makes it exceptionally effective against small, fast-moving surface targets in confined waters. The operational logic of using rotary wing aviation as the counter-swarm layer makes sense in the specific geometry of Hormuz. In a 21-mile-wide channel, where the engagement distances between threats and defenders are measured in single-digit miles, rather than the dozens or hundreds of miles that define open ocean naval warfare, the helicopter's agility and precision are better matched to the threat profile than a destroyer's long-range missile systems. You don't shoot a $2 million interceptor at a speedboat if you can put an Apache on station to handle it with a Hellfire. The economics and the geometry both point to helicopters as the counter-swarm instrument of choice in this specific environment. But here's where the real strategic tension lives. And it's the tension that keeps naval planners up at night, regardless of the tactical results on any given day. The helicopter solution works when the swarm size stays manageable. It works when the boats come in numbers that the rotary wing assets in the theater can engage and destroy before the saturation point is reached. What happens when the number goes from 20 boats to 50, from 50 to 150? The IRGC has the inventory to scale the attack if it chooses to. The dispersed command structure created by the 2008 IRGC reforms, which distributed operational authority down to 31 semi-autonomous regional corps, means that regional commanders can authorize and execute swarm attacks without waiting for centralized approval from a chain of command that no longer has a confirmed head. The IRGC naval commander was killed in March 2026, and no replacement has been publicly named. That decentralization cuts both ways. It means the swarm threat can materialize faster and with less warning than a centrally coordinated attack would require. It means individual regional commanders can make autonomous decisions to commit fast attack assets based on their local assessments and institutional interests without the moderating input of a strategic level commander who has to think about the American response those decisions will trigger. The missile launches, the 6 boats sunk on May 4th, the coordinated attack on the 3 destroyers on May 7th. These are the fingerprints of a decentralized command structure, producing autonomous operational decisions at the regional level, not a unified strategic campaign being managed from the top of a coherent chain of command. The global economic implications of what is happening in those 21 miles of water are staggering and deserve to be stated plainly. Before the current conflict began, roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas shipments passed through the Strait of Hormuz. That traffic has now been largely halted. The United Nations International Maritime Organization has reported that approximately 1,500 ships and 20,000 crew members are trapped in the Persian Gulf as a result of the strait's effective closure, unable to exit to open water because of a combination of Iranian mine-laying operations and the active conflict zone that the strait has become. Lloyd's List reported in early May 2026 that no commercial transits had taken place since May 4th, describing the waterway as effectively closed. The insurance markets have reacted accordingly. War risk premiums for vessels anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz have reached levels that make commercial transits economically irrational for most shipping companies. Even if the physical risk were manageable, when insured ships are sitting in port unable to move and the insurance underwriters have effectively priced transit out of the market, the strait is closed in every practical sense, regardless of what flags are flying over which piece of water. The energy market consequences of that closure cascade through the global economy in ways that compound over time. The immediate impact is price. Oil markets react to supply disruption with the kind of speed that no government policy response can match. But the medium-term consequences are more structurally damaging because they force the kind of supply chain restructuring that takes months and years to work through. Refineries built and calibrated to run on specific grades of Gulf crude cannot simply switch overnight to alternative feedstocks from different geographic sources. Tanker routing that has been optimized over decades around the assumption of Hormuz access requires complete operational redesign. The LNG receiving terminals in Japan, South Korea, and across Europe that depend on Gulf supply face the prospect of inventory drawdowns that compress into emergency procurement scenarios at exactly the moment when every other buyer is competing for the same alternative supply. The 1973 Arab oil embargo, which ran for roughly 6 months and involved a partial rather than complete interruption of Gulf supply, produced a global recession. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not a partial interruption. It is a near-complete closure of the world's most critical energy choke point, being enforced by a guerrilla navy with hundreds to thousands of fast attack boats and maintained by a decentralized command structure that can sustain the threat even while absorbing significant losses. The United States Navy's response architecture has been building out across the weeks of the conflict. And it's worth being specific about what that architecture actually consists of, because the public coverage has tended to focus on individual engagements without assembling the full picture of how American forces are approaching the swarm problem. The Carrier Strike Group operating in the Gulf of Oman anchors the air component. The FA-18 Super Hornets flying from the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush provide both the strike capability to hit Iranian launch sites and command facilities ashore, and the maritime patrol role that extends the air defense envelope around the destroyers transiting the strait. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye provides radar coverage, extending more than 400 miles from its operating altitude, tracking surface and air contacts throughout the theater, and feeding that picture to every platform in the network. The RQ-4 Global Hawks, maintaining persistent overhead surveillance at 60,000 feet, loitering for 30-plus hours, watching every boat that moves in the strait, and feeding continuous track data into the targeting system. The Link 16 network connecting all of these platforms into a single fused operational picture that any commander in the theater can pull up in real time. This is the surveillance and strike architecture that makes the defensive response to an IRGC swarm attack faster and more precise than it would be without it. American forces are not surprised by these attacks in the sense of not knowing they are coming. The Global Hawk and the Hawkeye have been watching the boats since before they left their bases. The decision cycle from boats departing hidden staging area to attack helicopters inbound is compressed by that persistent overhead picture into something that the IRGC planners have to account for in their tactical planning. But the swarm doctrine was designed with that surveillance capability in mind. The answer the IRGC has developed to the problem of being watched continuously from the air is not stealth, it's mass. When 40 boats launch simultaneously from 6 different coastal locations and converge on a target from multiple vectors, the challenge for the defending force is not detection, it's prosecution. You can see all 40 boats on the radar. Tracking them is not the limiting factor. Engaging them all before any of them reaches missile launch range against the ships you are protecting. That is the limiting factor. And the Hajar 110 standoff missile capability means that launch range is now 35 to 50 kilometers, which in the confined geometry of the Strait of Hormuz gives the defending force a very narrow time window between boat identified and missile away. At 110 knots, the Hajar 110 covers 50 kilometers in roughly 28 minutes at maximum speed. In a real engagement scenario with variable sea states, detection delays, and the fog of a multi-axis simultaneous attack, that window shrinks further. The defensive systems that need to work inside that window are the same systems being simultaneously tasked against the missile and drone components of the layered attack that IRGC doctrine pairs with the boat swarm. Every interceptor round expended against a drone is a round not available for a boat. Every Seahawk committed to prosecuting boats on one axis is a helicopter not available for the boats on another axis. The resource allocation problem under simultaneous multi-domain attack is real, and it's the problem the IRGC spent decades designing its tactics around. The historical context for this moment runs deeper than most current coverage acknowledges. The United States and Iran have been playing this specific chess game in the Persian Gulf since 1987, when Operation Earnest Will began and American warships started escorting Kuwaiti tankers through the same waterway that is now the center of the current conflict. The IRGC's answer to that escort operation was mining. The Kuwaiti supertanker SS Bridgeton, escorted by 4 American warships, including an Aegis cruiser, hit an Iranian mine on the very first convoy run. The most sophisticated naval escort force in the world could not prevent a piece of metal filled with explosives laid quietly on the seafloor from stopping a ship cold. That episode established the foundational principle that has guided Iranian maritime strategy ever since. You don't have to beat the American Navy in a fair fight. You just have to make the operational environment expensive, unpredictable, and exhausting enough that the political calculus shifts. In 1988, Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American surface naval battle since World War II, destroyed more than a third of Iran's operational naval force in a single day. Iran lost a frigate, a gunboat, 3 speedboats, and 2 oil platforms. The United States lost 2 crew members from a helicopter accident. By any conventional measure of military power, it was a decisive American victory. And Iran's response to that decisive defeat was not to build a bigger conventional navy. It was to go deeper into the asymmetric doctrine that the speedboats already represented. To build more of them, hide them better, arm them more heavily, and develop the swarm tactics that would make the sheer number and distributed nature of the threat the problem, rather than the individual platform capability. 38 years later, the doctrine has matured into something significantly more dangerous than the Boghammer speedboats fitted with rocket-propelled grenades that American helicopter crews destroyed in 1988. The Hajar 110 is not a Boghammer. The Nasser 1 anti-ship missile is not a rocket-propelled grenade. The dispersed swarm, coordinated across multiple approach vectors with integrated drone and missile layers, is not the simple mass attack that Operation Praying Mantis dismantled in a single afternoon. And the production capacity and dispersal architecture that can absorb 100 losses and remain fully operational is not the brittle conventional naval force that could be defeated in a day. The IRGC built the fleet it has today specifically because it studied what happened in 1988 and decided that the lesson was not, don't fight the American Navy, but rather fight the American Navy in the way that makes your advantages matter and their advantages irrelevant. What does all of this mean for where the Strait of Hormuz situation goes from here? The current picture, assembled from U.S. Central Command confirmed engagements, the shipping industry reporting, the IRGC's own public communications, and the broader strategic context of a conflict that has now compressed Iran's entire power structure while leaving its guerrilla navy intact and active, suggests that the strait is in a genuinely contested phase. Not contested in the sense that American forces are losing engagement after engagement. The tactical record is clear that American defensive systems have successfully handled every swarm attack thrown at them so far, with no American vessel struck despite sustained and coordinated Iranian efforts. But contested in the deeper sense that the cost of maintaining access to the waterway is real, continuous, and consuming resources. Interceptor rounds, helicopter flight hours, aircraft maintenance cycles, sailor fatigue, at a rate that the Iranian side can sustain far more cheaply than the American side can. The exchange rate problem doesn't disappear just because you're winning every individual engagement. If Iran can force the United States to spend $5 million in defensive resources to defeat an attack that cost Iran $500,000 to generate, Iran can keep generating attacks indefinitely while Washington watches the operational cost accumulate. That's the strategic logic behind the Mosquito fleet. And it's as valid in 2026 as it was when the IRGC naval commanders first articulated it decades ago. The 1,500 ships trapped in the Persian Gulf are the clearest measure of how effectively that logic is working in practice. Those vessels are not trapped because the IRGC Navy defeated the United States Navy in a conventional naval battle. They're trapped because the operational environment the IRGC has created in the Strait makes commercial transit an unacceptable risk for any shipping company or insurance underwriter that has to answer to shareholders and regulators. The American Navy can escort warships through the Strait. It demonstrated that on May 7th, when the 3 destroyers transited despite the attack and emerged undamaged. But it cannot simultaneously escort 1,500 commercial vessels, and the IRGC knows that. The swarm is not pointed at American warships as its primary strategic objective. The swarm is pointed at the calculation that insurance underwriters and shipping executives make when they decide whether to route their vessels through the world's most valuable maritime choke point. When that calculation consistently produces the answer, the risk is too high, the strait is functionally closed, regardless of what the American Navy does tactically. The path through this is not purely military, and it has never been. The strait has been a pressure point, a bargaining chip, a strategic lever that Iran has wielded in every major confrontation with the United States and its allies since 1987. The regime in Tehran knows that closing the strait is not a sustainable long-term strategy. The economic pain of a closed strait falls on Iran's neighbors and trading partners, many of whom have the political and economic relationships with Washington that Iran desperately needs to cultivate as it looks for a diplomatic exit from the current conflict. But as a tactical instrument to demonstrate that the cost of confronting Iran militarily is not zero and not cheap, the Mosquito fleet in the Strait of Hormuz is doing exactly what it was built to do. The 6 boats that went to the bottom on May 4th are already replaced by the production lines and hidden stockpiles that the IRGC has been building for decades. The swarm that was repelled on May 7th will be reconstituted and launched again. And somewhere in the sea caves along the Persian Gulf coastline, in the underground naval facilities carved into the mountains above the water's surface, in the dispersed staging areas on the islands that dot the strait approaches, the next wave of boats is waiting. The IRGC Navy's commander is dead. His replacement has not been named. The chain of command above the regional corps level is uncertain, and the Mosquito fleet is still flying. That is the picture of the Strait of Hormuz in May of 2026. The most powerful navy in the world and the most creative guerrilla maritime force ever built are locked in a confrontation over 21 miles of water that the global economy cannot afford to lose. The destroyers are holding, the helicopters are shooting, the interceptors are flying, and somewhere below the radar horizon, in waters that were designed by geography and perfected by doctrine for exactly this kind of warfare, more boats are coming.